One of the effects of my cataract surgery this week is that I'm sort of seeing double, so to me, there's an immense crowd out here today. Would you pray with me? Oh God, may the meditations of my heart and the words which come out of my mouth be acceptable to you, O God, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Well, stories. We continue with stories, and at the beginning of the first book of Samuel is the story, the beginnings of that prophet. And the story goes like this. His mother, Hannah, is one of two wives to Elkanah, and the other wife is Peninnah. I'm sure you're going to remember all those names. Well, Peninnah was able to have children, but Hannah was, as biblical language tends to go, was barren and was very distressed by the fact that she was unable to bear children. And it just focused in her mind so much. And Peninnah, the other wife, even made fun of Hannah, it says in the story, which just made it that much worse. So years went by, and finally she became so desperate that she went to the temple and she prayed fervently, but she did so silently in front of the temple. And so she was praying to God, saying to God, please, God, give me a child, give me a son, and if you do, I will consecrate my son to you for all of his life. I will give him to you all of his life. Well, Eli, the old priest in the temple, saw this woman seemingly muttering, and he thought she was drunk. And he chastised her for being drunk. She says, no, I'm not drunk. I'm just so fervently in desire of having a child, having God give me a boy so that I in turn can give the boy to God. And Eli blessed her and said, what you have asked for will happen. And indeed, he was correct. She bore a child, and she named him Samuel, which means I asked God for him. And Samuel was born. When he was weaned, it says in the Bible, it's a little unclear how old he was, but when he was weaned, she then took him to the temple and offered him to Eli. And therefore, Samuel, literally from the time he was a very little boy, lived in the temple and was, in essence, Eli's helper or apprentice. And here, then, begins the story which we're taking up for today. Now, the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room, and the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. And then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel. And he responded, here I am. And then he ran to Eli and he said, here I am, for you called me. But Eli said, I did not call. Go back to sleep. So Samuel went and lay down. And the Lord called again, Samuel. Samuel went up and went to Eli and he said, here I am, for you called me. But Eli said, I did not call, my son. Go back to sleep. Now, Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again, a third time, and he got up and he went to Eli and he said, here I am, for you called me. And then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. And therefore, Eli said to Samuel, "Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Wow. What a great story. I love that story. Isn't it a wonderful story? However, as usual, there's more than meets the eye, right? For example, let's be candid. It's really hard if you say you're going to accept this completely literally. It's really hard for us to accept the idea of a little boy, maybe as young as 3 years old, 4 years old, being given away by his mother to live in the temple with this old man for the rest of his life. He has no voice in the matter. His mother says, "I've done this because I've promised God that I'm going to give my son to God." Wow. Could you do that? Could you take one of your children, your firstborn child, and say, "Here, God, he's going to be Pete Knetcher's servant for the rest of his life"? I don't think so. It's a little hard. So this idea is difficult. There's more that I think is somewhat difficult. Eli is a very, very old man. We learn later on that he's well into his 90s at the point where this story is being told, and we learn in the story that his eyesight is failing him. Probably his hearing is failing him as well. So again, I imagine part of what's happening here. First of all, it says to us, the word of the Lord is rare in those days. Is the word of the Lord rare in our day? Depends on how you look at it, right? Sometimes I think the word of the Lord is just completely absent in our time and in the world we live in. The word of the Lord is rare, and visions were even more rare. Prophets didn't exist. It was a rough time, in other words. And if you were to read more about the story, you would find out that Eli, this very faithful priest, head priest in the temple, has horrible family members and is cursed by God because of the terrible things that his sons are doing out in the real world. And Eli dies a horrible death, just a horrible death, and so do his sons. So it's a difficult time. It's important for us to remember that the story also says that Samuel did not yet know the Lord. Now, at the point where this story is being told, Samuel, it may be, give or take, 12 years old. We don't know for sure, but thereabouts. He did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not been revealed to him, though he had been living in the temple for 10 years, maybe, 8, 9, 10 years. These are all the details of the story that we're apt to sort of skip or not pay attention to when we read this fascinating story about Samuel. And then at the end, it talks about the fact that Samuel, when he grows up, that he becomes this trustworthy servant of the Lord. He has responded to God's call, and he says, "Here I am, your servant, I'm listening." And now he becomes, over time, this prophet who is trustworthy. And it says, none of his words, which I love the language, fall to the ground, meaning they're all true. They're all true. So when he speaks, you can trust his word. When he speaks for God, you can trust him to be God's spokesperson. Sort of an appropriate story as we deal with the memory and the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. To be called. To be called. We use the term perhaps somewhat freely, somewhat easily sometimes. Certainly not all of us are called specifically by God to serve exclusively God or to be professional people in the clergy. We, in our church, have been hearing a good bit about a call to a certain person in our midst. Kevin has received the call from God and is working on how to respond to that. Where will that take Kevin? And that's not yet clear. What Kevin knows at this point, and I can't speak for you, but he's told us, is that God has called upon me. I think about my call. And you know what? I was recalled, which meant that there must have been a defect, and so therefore, God called me again because I needed to have the factory fix me as of 2015. I'd been out. I had skipped away from my call for 4 years, and I was seemingly doing just fine, and then I'm recalled. So the question always runs around in my own head and in my mind and in my heart. How do I know this is God calling me? How do I know it's not just the district superintendent making that decision? It has nothing to do with God. This is just our system calling me. And I don't know that there's a perfect answer to that, except that which is in my heart. That which is in my heart. That even though when Dottie told me the DS is going to call you a couple of days from now, and he's going to ask you to step in. And I said, oh no, he won't. She was right. And then I had to make that decision about, is this call from God? Do I need to respond to that? Do I want to respond to that? One of my former members of a former church who is now 101 years old and still living, still very bright, told me more than once, preachers never retire. I said, well, thank you very much. That's not good news at all, you know. But I'm learning, and Kevin will learn, what that means. What that means. Samuel, when he heard that call from God, most surely did not fully grasp the power of that moment. It had to take some time for him to come to terms with, what does that mean? Now that I've said, I'm here, I'm listening, God. What does that mean? I think we are living in what sometimes are grim days. Very grim days. There's a lot about which we can legitimately be concerned in our nation, in our world. We need the call of God, not just to those who are going into ministry, but to each and every single one of us. We need to hear God's call. And what does that mean in our individual lives? And what does that mean for the life of us as a community of faith, as a church family? That we need to listen for what God is saying to us and be those people who take that message into our world. It's needed more than ever. I'm convinced of that. It's needed more than ever. It's not that God is absent. It's that we're not listening perhaps as intently as we could or should. That's the message for me from the story of Samuel, who I know had to work out what it meant and how difficult it must have been sometimes to be the prophet for God, how difficult it was for Martin Luther King to follow that call, knowing what might happen and what in fact ultimately did happen to him, and all the hardships that went with that as he walked that path. So you and I, we need to listen for God's call. We need to listen, and when God speaks to us, we need to be prepared to say, "Speak, God. We, your servants, are listening." Amen.